Welcome to the Environmental Justice Lab podcast. I am your host, Dr. Lesley Joseph, and today we have two very, very, very special guests joining us. They've written a great book, came out last year. It's called Powerless, The People's Struggle for Energy. And they are with us today. On my screen to the right is Dr. Diana Hernández. She is the Associate Professor of Socio-Medical Sciences in the Mailman School of Public Health at Columbia University. She is also the founding principal investigator of the Energy, Equity, Housing, and Health Program and the co-director of the Energy Opportunity Lab at the Center on Global Energy Policy. And to my left on my screen is Dr. Jennifer Laird. She is an assistant professor of sociology at Lehman College. Ladies, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast.
Thank you for having us. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, no, great. I'm so glad you're here. We are talking about energy insecurity, and it's the right time to talk about it because it's really, really, really hot outside. I don't know where you are. I'm in South Carolina. I told my daughter, she plays tennis competitively. I said, look, we're picking you up at 12 o'clock because it's way too hot to be out there any longer. She wants to stay till 3. I said, not today because it's really hot. And so I'm so glad that I have this opportunity to speak to both of you about energy insecurity, energy policy, all things energy. And I can't wait to get into it. So let me just start with this. So in the book, on the first page of the introduction, you say, I'm going to read it because it's a great book. It says, household energy, a fundamental requirement for anyone to fully participate in modern society, fosters health, productivity, and a dignified existence. So I'm going to start with Dr. Hernández. Can you tell me just how important is energy in our everyday life, and what is it like when we don't have it?
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Leslie, for having us. It's really an honor to be on the podcast. And I'm just going to, you started with the story, so I'll start with the story and say that, right now I am running on a computer. My phone is charging. I have an air conditioning unit, a fan in the background, lights. There are ways in which energy is surrounding my very existence right now as I sit and execute this podcast with you and Jen. So that to me is really about kind of the backdrop in which energy basically powers the basic essentials of life: refrigeration, cooking, lighting, cooling, heating. And even though we may not pay attention to it, because it is what we say in the book is that it's the software, it's the operating system that really allows for a home to be habitable and to be livable, for food to be eaten and prepared, and stored properly, etc. Right? We kind of take it for granted. And yet it's right there without it. And when it crashes or when it's unavailable, it really becomes, you realize how central it is actually to our everyday existence.
Yeah, perfect. Dr. Laird, so just piggybacking off of that, I know looking at your bio, you do a lot of work in the poverty sector. You've done a lot of research on poverty and various forms of inequity and insecurity. What has your understanding of this issue been like in terms of people that you may have worked with or places that you've done research in as it relates to energy, and how does that fit into the kind of work that you've been doing as a researcher and as a professional?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you, Dr. Joseph, for having us. I have to admit, before I started collaborating with Dr. Hernández on this work, coming from the poverty policy world, I myself overlooked this issue, in part because if you look at the safety net budget of the federal government, energy assistance is a very small share of that. Much larger share goes to food assistance or to cash assistance. And so I am embarrassed to admit I just dismissed the problem because the solution was so small. Now that we've done the research, or now that I've become part of this work, I realize that the solution being so small is part of the problem, right? So the reason why it's such a pervasive problem is because we're not doing enough to deal with it. But after I started collaborating with Diana And I understood two things. The problem was much more prevalent than I previously realized. So this wasn't hundreds of thousands of households, which I think is what I had been thinking based on what happens when you take away energy assistance or not. It was millions of households. And, but the other thing I realized once, so Diana's done a lot of qualitative work in this space. She traveled around the country. So all the qualitative work on the book is based on the qualitative data she collected traveling around the country, all around the country, including Puerto Rico, the Northeast, all the regions of the country, meeting with people at energy assistance centers, meeting with practitioners. The severity of the problem is what I understood or started to understand once I looked at the qualitative data, because it's the narrative accounts in the book that I would argue are just as, or maybe even more, as a quantitative sociologist, I find the qualitative data even more compelling, because there's an aspect, there's the dignity aspect of this. So it's happening inside the home. We all know what it's like to want to host people in our home and what it's like if your house is a total mess. But let's say if your house is way too hot or way too cold, or you don't have the lights on, you can't turn on the lights. So there's a dignity aspect and a humiliation aspect of what's going on. And people really who are experiencing the most severe forms, or even trying to avoid a disconnection, kind of what Diana has coined, this vigilant conservation of just trying to avoid a disconnection or avoid arrearages, creates these trade-offs where, people are going to families are going to feed their kids tuna fish sandwiches for a week just so they can pay the utility bill. Or we're not going to use the heater. We're not going to use the AC. And the humanity or the inhumanity of it became apparent to me once I started to look at the qualitative data. And there's a lot of families out there that are suffering within their homes in ways that are humiliating.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think you're right. And don't be embarrassed. I mean, a lot of us hadn't thought about this as an issue to be concerned about when it comes to energy insecurity. I know for me and my family, I have 4 children. And so we always talk about how, okay, we need to keep the thermostat here. We need to do this way. And it's never, and I should say it's about energy conservation. It's about the environment. But honestly, it's about cutting that bill down. And so how are we going to keep this energy bill as low as possible? And I think some people think about energy as something that you can manage if you kind of operate in certain ways, in certain capacities, and not really a function of being secure, insecure. And so just for us listening, and for those of us who don't know, Dr. Hernandez, can you define for us what energy insecurity actually is and how you'd be able to identify if someone is in fact energy insecure? Because I'm sure it's more than just, oh no, this month the bill is really high, I don't know how to pay it. I'm sure it goes beyond that, just like how food insecurity goes beyond just hunger. And so how would you define that for us?
Yeah, that's such a good question. Basically, I would say that, first of all, the way that energy insecurity is kind of formally defined is the inability to adequately meet household energy needs. And that definition is purposely broad. So it has like an economic component, like you were saying, where, it's partly about like energy conservation, but really that is a means to an end around keeping the bills as low as possible. Because the bill component, even for people that have, let's say, financial that are financially secure, they might still be wanting to save on their bills, because who wants to pay more when they don't have to? And then there's another piece of it, which is about housing and the physical conditions of housing, and whether or not your home is equipped with a proper cooling and heating system, an up-to-date electrical panel that allows you to power like the technologies of today. And then there's also now increasingly the issue of power outages. As we speak, it's 99 degrees in New York City. And since yesterday, when this kind of heat wave began, I guess on Sunday, today's Tuesday. So we're now in day 3 of it. And basically, within 24 hours, we already started to see many power outages in all parts of the city. And then telecommunications outages and all of this stuff because our systems aren't really built for extreme heat and also
Mhm.
for extensive energy consumption. And so, on the one hand, this physical aspect also includes like the grid like the energy infrastructure that then powers our homes and everything else. And then there's the coping aspect. So Jen was talking about like how people are vigilantly conserving their energy, but there are ways in which people are trading off between medicine and food and energy, or as the story of Alicia shows, like buying something like shoes, replacing shoes in order to, and prioritizing a utility bill, even though her child's sneakers were like well past like they needed to be replaced.
Mhm.
It could also be that people are seeking assistance and they're seeking help. So there are essential elements of energy insecurity. And since you pointed it out, I want to just talk about what those essential elements are. So on the economic side, the ways that you would know that people are energy insecure is that they present with difficulty paying their utility bills. Either that it's a real hardship to like actually pay the bill when it's due, or that they're late, or they only make partial payments, that they've accrued utility debt, so they're behind on their utility bills. And that basically means that that triggers a disconnection notice. So now they're at risk of a disconnection. Then you have on the physical side, you have um, deficiencies and inefficiencies. And then also those power outages that I talked about. On the coping side, there's difficult choices. So those trade offs. There's also thermal discomfort, in the
Mhm.
sense that like you might be experiencing really like extremely high or extremely low indoor temperatures. So it's really cold in your house or really warm. And that's kind of either intentional, again, to save, or it has to do with the fact that your energy systems at home are inadequate for the conditions. They don't work, they've fallen into disrepair. And also deprivation, this idea of like under consuming energy, again,
Right.
to save. And just like we have a way of describing food insecurity, so like hunger as one example, an instance that's a bit more universal about when people are feeling like, all right, like my next meal should come. But hunger being kind of an extended version of that, again, because maybe it's challenging to afford food rather. On the energy side, we talk about that as drain. And it's not just that, like we talk about it.
Mm.
This is how participants talked about it. They talked about their pockets feeling drained, the appliances kind of draining, the cost and that kind of thing, that the experience itself was draining. But malnutrition is kind of the extreme version of hunger. And in
Mhm.
our work, depletion is the extreme version of drain. So we wanted to find language that helped us to describe that more visceral feeling of being energy insecure, which is drain, but also like when it's nonstop, it's kind of an incessant hardship that like weighs
Mhm.
on you for extended periods of time, like how depleting that feels, and it can be for any given household. So those are the essential elements. And we in the book we talk about symptoms and like being able to properly diagnose energy insecurity, because now we have better language that describes these kind of indicators or symptoms of energy insecurity, so that then on the other side of it, we can treat the conditions, right? Like you can't really
Mhm.
solve a problem or treat a problem that hasn't been well characterized. And that's really in some ways the biggest goal of the book.
Oh, interesting. Interesting. When you think about these dimensions and these elements, is it a situation where when you're trying to understand someone's situation and their energy security or insecurity, do you need to exhibit multiple indicators? Is it just one? Is it over a certain period of time? Because I imagine, depending on where you live, summers are more consumptive than winters, or maybe vice versa, or falls and springs. And so maybe if I can just get through this heat wave, like you're describing, we'll be okay again because the bills come down. I run things less often. We'll be fine. Maybe I'm not energy insecure as a result of that, but maybe if it's been 6 months or I haven't paid my bill in a year or however long they allow you to not pay it, then I'm described as that. Like, is there a way of really identifying and pinpointing it on households and individuals?
Yeah, so I mean, we went through, this. It's a peer reviewed book, and initially we wanted to just be able to like lay out the indicators,
Mhm.
but we had some economists, and they were like, "Well, try to be as conservative as possible in your
Oh,
estimation," and so it's conditioned on receiving a disconnection notice, but the idea is also that there are two or more that you experience two or more of these indicators, right? So we just kind of lay out, and Jen, I don't know if you want to talk about this. This is in chapter 2 of the book where we talk about the prevalence of
yeah.
energy insecurity. But basically, the idea isn't necessarily that you just have like a power outage and then you're energy insecure, but that there's an aspect of it that's related to financial hardship, and that
Mhm.
conditioning around like basically being behind on your utility bills, that really is kind of shows the layering and like the cumulative burden of these experiences, and that the financial hardship, because most people can get out of a situation if they have enough money, but if you have financial
Right.
hardship, it makes it harder to like again like use the air conditioning without concern, or like repair something that has fallen into disrepair, an appliance or something, when it does, or to just stay on top of your bills, right? So like there's that combination of things, and that's part of the reason why it isn't just one, it's actually conditioned on at least two. Jen, I don't know if there's anything else you want to say.
Yeah, I would add that if you look at the data, the survey data, it's clear. So, for example, like 1 in 5 households reports that at some point in the past year they've had to reduce or forego food or medicine to pay an energy bill. So that's not a disconnection notice. That's not a disconnection. But that's a pretty big sacrifice that people are making to keep up with their utility bills. And so that's that vigilant conservation that we pick up in the data, kind of trying to avoid the crisis. But that in itself, even though those a lot of those families would not qualify for energy assistance, for example, but they're if I'm giving up food or medicine to pay my energy bill, I would argue that's a significant
Mhm.
hardship. And so that's kind of one of the more broader indicators. And then you can see if you narrow in, roughly like 16% of households are in arrears with their utility provider. And then, roughly 10% of households have received a disconnection notice in the past year. And then 2 to 3 million households, or about 3%, have experienced a disconnection. So we're talking about millions of households, but the the indicators of the problem are
Mhm.
widespread, and you see a lot of activity prior to the crisis of avoidance, or people kind of this vigilant conservation that households are going through. That in and of itself is extremely stressful, and you don't want families having to give up their diabetes medication so they can pay their utility bill. That's where like some of these health consequences pop up.
Yeah, no, I mean, that would be awful. Um, and, this is a different kind of podcast, and so I know there are a lot of, economists, there's a lot of kind of quantitatively driven, data-driven types of analysts who really do want to be able to put numbers to things, but we are talking about people, and the fact that people are having to do over and above what the average family would do just to try and keep things moving and keep things on, I think is something that we really should take note of, because the fact that you're able to avoid these indicators by shedding other life-giving aspects of your existence, in my opinion, isn't really helpful and doesn't really constitute the kind of life that you want to live, which you want people to have all that they need to make it through. Because I was just thinking about this. So my only corollary is food. I've done some food research, so I can think about it in those terms. And maybe, Jen, you can help me with this, because in the food world, there's levels of insecurity, right? There's low, there's moderate, there's high, there's severe. And it's based on the access that you have to food, is based on your economic situation, it's based on your household size, like lots of different characteristics can place you in one of those categories. And it's usually identified by the household themselves, right? You're doing the survey, you're saying, I've, not eaten this meal. I've, foregone my meal to give meals to my children this many days of the week. And you're kind of identifying in yourself. Is there something similar to that in the energy space where there's a low, medium, high? Are there ways that you've kind of seen people, just not by the numbers, but the people themselves having to do things differently to manage those issues? And how do you kind of understand what the situation truly is, not what we would like to say it is based on the numbers, but what things are really like for these kinds of families?
Yeah, we when we were working on the book and going through peer review, and a lot of the reviewers were very familiar, like yourself, with the food insecurity literature. And we went through a period where we're like, okay, let's create an energy insecurity indicator that's very as similar as possible to the USDA food indicators of, based on levels of severity. And the challenge there was that those indicators are based in large part on uh, not having the resource. So how many days were you hungry? How many meals did you have to go
Right.
without? And so when we tried to say, okay, how long have you been without energy? How long have you not been able to turn on the lights or something? That's the crisis point of energy insecurity. And what precedes that also is part of the problem, thermal discomfort. And you also mentioned the issue of self-reporting in surveys, which some reviewers are very quick to latch onto.
Hmm.
So the survey data that we use is the Residential Energy Consumption Survey, a federally funded survey of nationally representative households, a survey that is nationally representative of U.S. households. And one of our indicators is, have you kept your home at an unhealthy temperature? And that's the wording of the survey question. What is unhealthy to you may not be unhealthy to
Right.
me, both objectively and subjectively. And so there's always issues with the indicators. I think when I'm talking to someone who's not familiar with this issue, sometimes I have found, and Diana can weigh in too, because she has a lot more experience than I do in talking to kind of general audiences about this. Talking about disconnection notices and disconnections sometimes is a way to anchor the issue, because we're not going to get into debates about what is really unhealthy, what is thermal discomfort. So I think if you're talking to, a room full of economists, for example, I would anchor or I would at least begin the discussion in the world of disconnection notices and disconnections. But the problem with that, and Diana's argued this a lot, is that's the crisis point, and a good safety net program would intervene far
That's
earlier
right.
than that. When like people are giving up food or medicine to pay their energy bill, intervene even earlier when they're keeping the thermostat way too high or way too low. But Diana, you probably have some thoughts on this.
Yeah, I happen to be looking at page 112 in the book. It's figure 6.1, where we just talk about like extreme indoor temperatures. So your home is extremely cold or it's extremely hot. And there we kind of break it down by the number of days that people are reporting their homes being either one. And
Hmm.
food insecurity like has these kind of the breakdown of moderate or severe or kind of low food insecurity, We actually take a little bit of a different stance because it's so really anchored in the dimensions of energy insecurity that we present a lot of the data as economic and physical and coping. So, like, at what point are you actually showing signs of severity by virtue of these issues being stacked? And there,
Mhm.
actually, what you see is that there's almost no distinction between homes being too hot or too cold at an extreme level when households are experiencing both physical and economic aspects of energy insecurity. And the reason why we could be a little bit more detailed here is that in addition to Rex, I also designed and fielded a survey called the Energy Equity Housing and Health Survey, which was done after I had done all of the in-depth interviews. So it was informed by not just having literally freshly done a bunch of interviews, but also a body of work that preceded it that was trying to be more precise again. And like, how do we distinguish between these different issues? Like, an unhealthy temperature, not only is it like an objective or subjective issue, it really doesn't distinguish between the seasonality. And like, one of the things that we know, and a lot of the work that I've been doing separate from our collaborative work, has been based in New York City, not exclusively, but some of it. And, related to heating seasons or the lack of air conditioning and whatever. And all of a sudden, the picture of energy insecurity and when people are experiencing these hardships really changes based on seasonality. So, what we
Mhm.
wanted to be able to talk about was the depth of the severity based on how people, if they only have economic issues or if they only have physical issues or none, right? What you see kind of over and over again is that energy secure households, first of all, they just present with less risk, not surprising. But people that then on the opposite side have this like multi-dimensional experience of energy insecurity, they show up on the
Mhm.
most extreme levels. They're the ones that are most at risk for disconnections. They're also the ones when they are disconnected to be most active in trying to sort out that crisis, that conundrum, that like needing to reach out to family and friends and to churches and to get energy assistance and to do all of that stuff. In the meantime, actually, most people are doing so much to be self-sacrificial in
Mhm.
their and how they deal with energy insecurity, like making it a private matter, not necessarily involving, also because it's burdensome to do so, like to travel different places. This chapter 6 is really about a woman who goes to a food bank, right? On a regular basis and feels really welcome there. Has options in terms of like what kind of food, allotment is appropriate for her and her family based on what they like, their preferences, their family size, etc. And that's one piece of it, but the other piece of it is like why that same person that does show up to the food pantry doesn't show up to the energy assistance offices, and it's because they want all this paperwork.
Mhm.
It's so challenging to go like all the different offices, and when you finally do get the help, oftentimes it's not enough. So
Right.
we were talking about crisis, right? And one of the things that we learned from this book is that people are in fact reaching out for help when they are at highest risk of or experiencing an active disconnection,
Mhm.
um, and multiple layers of energy insecurity. But we, from a preventive standpoint, right? I'm a professor of public health, and public health is all built on prevention. And you can't do preventive work if you're only kind of reaching people when they're in the emergency room, essentially.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with that. And so let's talk about that. So when someone is experiencing these markers, these dimensions, these signs of energy insecurity, I imagine so on the food side, we have SNAP, the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. For those of us who don't have enough money to kind of sustain our everyday existence, we have TANF, the Temporary Assistance for Needy Families. I would imagine that there's an energy version of this that people could tap into? You're mentioning going to the energy assistance offices, energy assistance program. Like, what are those, and how does one get those resources into their homes and get that help to deal with energy insecurity? Because I imagine it's something similar to these other programs. Maybe it's not. I could use some help understanding that more. So, what can someone do when they're in these situations?
So there is the Low Income Home Energy Assistance Program, also known as LIHEAP.
Okay.
Although all of the federal employees of LIHEAP were fired in the past few months by the Trump administration. So the future of that program is in jeopardy. And Diana can probably talk more about that. But again, situating it against SNAP and TANF. So I believe the latest numbers I saw was that SNAP gets to more than 80% of all those who qualify. LIHEAP, the main energy assistance federal benefit, only reaches roughly 20% of those who are eligible. And so there's a lot of families, of the 72 million households that are eligible, roughly only 14.5 million receive any kind of assistance. And the benefit that they get has some limitations in that it's mostly designed as a program for people in cold weather states or experiencing cold weather hardships. There's a seasonality of it. In many places, it just runs out, and so is no longer available after a certain time point in the season. And the benefit itself is insufficient. So the average heating expenditure or LIHEAP heating grant, I believe, is a little over $400. And we all know, especially in cold weather states, families that are in arrearages are experiencing usually amounts that are much greater than that. I don't know. Diana probably has something to add to that as well.
Yeah. So LIHEAP is the kind of backbone of the U.S.'s energy assistance, like safety net, right? So like you have this program. It's really intended, as Jen was saying, to help people heat their homes. For the longest time, it was actually called the Low Income Home Heating Energy Assistance Program. So like it's based in the history of that program, which was in the 1970s. There was an oil crisis, and that oil crisis affected heating fuels. And it was designed kind of rapidly, just like we actually had these like rapid response policies in COVID. That was also true in that period. Now, 40 years later, the program hasn't really been reimagined or updated relative to what's happening these days, which is that utility bills are high around the year, not necessarily only in the winter season. That people with some of the highest burdens are actually in the Southeast. So you're in South Carolina, right? Like Alabama, Mississippi, South Carolina, Texas, Arizona, very hot places where there's, in some places high poverty. And then in other places, it's a question of high temperatures and the need to cool, and how much more expensive that tends to be. But the formula that kind of guides the distribution of LIHEAP resources is based on primarily heating degree days, which is like the number of days that are required to heat your home. So it's based on like outdoor temperature, and then cooling degree days. But in order for you to really activate more of the cooling degree days, the funding formula from 1984, not the 1981 formula, has to be activated. We're just talking about antiquated energy assistance policies and programs that are helpful, but they are not adequate to meet the demands of today. Which actually, I think, when I think about the timing of this book, I have been working on this work for a very long time. And, I think building up a field of research kind of takes a lot of time, and it takes a lot of different angles and ways to look at something and whatever. But I think what's been kind of most interesting about releasing this book in this moment is that many more people are wondering about their utility bills. I just
Mhm.
posted an op-ed today about, like, elections. We have a little bit more attention on energy affordability from a political perspective, but not enough, right? Like, but there's a little bit more activity, a lot more awareness about this, because we used to be able to take for granted energy as like a really inexpensive service,
Right.
and that's just no longer the case. And so we're at this kind of precipice now, this like moment in time when it could either go really bad or it can go better. But there's uncertainty in the continuation of LIHEAP and the kind of sister program, which is the weatherization assistance program, which actually helps to like weatherize, make more efficient homes. And I want to say that there's uncertainty because a lot of, the pattern has been threats that really like put everybody in some kind of like a chaotic scramble, and then
Mhm.
a recalibration to like the norm. So I don't, I feel like I don't necessarily want to participate in the alarmist like nature of things, but I will say that undoubtedly federal funding, even if it stayed at its kind of current levels, is insufficient for the
Mhm.
magnitude of the problem that we have not only exposed in this book, but that many people are experiencing in so many different ways. So we need more state level participation. We need more cities. We need utilities. We need many more people to be involved on the solution side, given the complexity and the growing kind of intensity of this issue.
Yeah, I mean, when you were talking about the federal programs and the way that things have changed with the new administration, the first thing I thought about was the role that states play, because that's usually the big um, push when this happens. The idea is that the states know better what people need. They're more localized. They're more um, they're better positioned to help those in need. And so, do you have any sense? This is for either of you. Do you have any sense of what states are doing? Is there a common kind of state practice to help people who deal with energy insecurity? Is it wildly varying from state to state, where there's some that have great ones and some states have none? Like, what is your understanding of the landscape, state to state across the country, when it comes to this kind of assistance that people need?
I mean, I'll start and just say it's very patchwork. So in the president's budget, skinny budget, where they eliminated LIHEAP just recently, that was submitted to Congress, they argued that you don't need federal energy assistance. States already provide disconnection protections. Well, first of all, that's not true. There's almost a dozen states that don't provide cold weather disconnection protections. I think more than 20 states don't provide hot weather disconnection protections. A dozen states don't, protect vulnerable families from disconnections. So if we just rely on the states, there are some states that are more innovative than others. California, for example, I think, and Diana can talk about it in more detail, has been more innovative than other states. But when we look at where the problem is most severe, and you see this too with poverty,
Hmm.
that in the southeastern US, poverty is high. It's also where energy insecurity is high, and where it's only getting higher, in part because of economic indicators, but also because of
Hmm.
climate change. It's only getting hotter. Severe weather is only getting more severe. And so, and those are the states that are the least protective and the least likely to intervene when interventions need to be done. So if we just rely on the states, a lot of families will suffer.
Hmm.
Well,
Diane, I'm sure you have
yeah, I mean,
something to
I'll just
add.
Yeah.
add and say that I think it's only 9 states that actually have programs above and beyond the block grants that are given by LIHEAP to the states and territories in the US. So there's very little participation beyond what the federal government actually allocates for this. And so some states have done things like energy assistance, or like discounts, utility discounts. In New York State, where we are, the energy affordability program came out of one rate case. So it's a statewide utility discount, and that kind of is across the board. So with investor-owned utilities, people are able to get some sizable portion of their utility bill reduced, and that
Mm-hmm.
helps. There are other states that do percent of income payment plans. In Colorado, where they have an active PIP program, only 8% of all eligible households are actually enrolled. So one of the things that we basically know is that there are programs that are on the books, but they're not programs that people are making the most use of. And for whatever
Mm-hmm.
reason, I think it's kind of attached to this idea that it's difficult to enroll, it's difficult to recertify, it's like a challenge to like prove your case and your, like eligibility for these programs. But it means that also like a lot of resources are left on the table even when there's so much need, right?
Mm-hmm.
And like to me, that's probably one of the most ironic aspects of this is that there's a little bit of an underutilization and under enrollment, but there's also like so that means sometimes that there's resources left on the table, but it could also mean, as Jen kind of alluded to earlier, that there's just not enough in the pot to begin with to really go around and support people as they need help.
Yeah, yeah. And as you're talking, I'm thinking about how, and of course, the pandemic was an awful time for a lot of reasons. A lot of people lost their lives. A lot of people were driven into poverty as a result. But then there was a response from the government that was very hopeful in that moment. I mean, there was this kind of universal, we're not going to cut your water off. We're not going to cut your power off. I remember there was free school lunch, which was so exciting. Like everybody had lunches every day. There was no, is it free or reduced? We had this kind of imaginative approach to ensuring that everyone's needs were met. And obviously that those programs have not been renewed, they have not been continued, but it did demonstrate that there is a possibility that those things could actually be in place and be a part of how we just operate as a country and not this current situation that we're in. And there's a line in your book that I loved reading it, but then I got sad after I read it. It says, for one, it says, under the previous administration, energy policies centered disadvantaged communities as primary beneficiaries of the clean energy transition, and it unfolded rapidly, but these programs were never fully realized. And then you say, given the outcome of the 2024 election, the continuation of these programs are in doubt. And so the results are in. The Trump administration is back in the White House. So you've mentioned this before, Jen, that the LIHEAP program has been discontinued, or the people have been all let go from working on that program. What would you say has been we'll call it fallout, or the impact of this new administration's actions in the energy security realm? And what do you see as some of the biggest challenges that are kind of either emerging or that have really been amplified by this administration's actions? We'll start with Jen. You're the quantitative one.
Sure. I would say we don't know yet. And the problem is there's two problems. One, by the time the data comes in, so now you brought up the pandemic and poverty during the pandemic. We know that poverty actually went down during the pandemic. The poverty rate went down because of all the emergency funds that were available for families and the payments that went out to families from the federal government. You saw a similar thing with energy insecurity in that there were widespread disconnection moratoriums during the pandemic. Everyone agreed we should not disconnect families during the pandemic. And so energy insecurity also did not go up during the pandemic because of that. The issue that I'm concerned, so the two issues are that it takes time for the data to come in and to be collected for us to see, okay, quantitatively, how much worse are things getting right now? But what I really worry about is how this administration is shutting down data collection efforts. So they're shutting down, getting rid of the people who do administer the surveys, who field the surveys, who analyze the surveys. I mean, these surveys take a lot of work. And so I worry that we might not even get the data to tell us what the impacts are. I'm sure Diana has some other thoughts on this as well.
Well, yeah, I mean, on the data side, the data availability question, right? The Rex is administered every 4 years, and released, like even with some time after that. And that makes it challenging because it's like, okay, every 4 years, like that's just not um, a viable kind of like time frame to be tracking these issues. But I
Mm-hmm.
was going to take the response to that question a little bit in a different direction, which is that this current administration has been talking a lot about energy dominance. And the idea is like if
That's right.
you flood the markets with fossil fuel based
Mm-hmm.
energy, that'll drive down the cost. And basically, that will be the kind of secret sauce in making energy more affordable. Now, what, and because the contrast that you kind of highlighted in the passage that you wrote in the book is that we were on a very different path just a few months ago. And that path was about embracing a clean energy economy, a just energy transition, basically moving in the direction of leveraging rooftop solar, and decarbonizing, our energy systems and also our homes, and just something that is like less polluting, and more equitably like resourced and designed at the outset, right? So Justice 40, like with all of the different like mandates around ensuring that households that live in disadvantaged communities had a resounding amount of like the benefits of the clean energy transition. That was just
Mm-hmm.
like halted, even though most of the big ticket, projects and like infrastructure development projects are happening in red states. This idea around energy dominance and embracing fossil fuels and basically heavily polluting energy sources puts communities that are experiencing energy insecurity in new forms of risk and hardship, right? Like it's like Hurricane Helene in North Carolina. It's the
Mm-hmm.
wildfires in the West. It's all these things that are also like make it that much more challenging for the households that are experiencing energy insecurity also to experience and recover from these kind of big climate events, like extreme weather events. And so that notion of like denying that climate change exists, like basically moving in a very different direction in terms of energy sourcing, and really just stifling any progress toward a clean and just energy transition is to me like what characterizes the priorities of the current administration when it comes to some of these issues.
I'm so glad you brought that up because I was going to go into the policy side, but we got to push this a little bit more because I can hear. I'm in South Carolina, um, very red, very much fossil fuel, oil and gas based industries from here all the way through down to Texas, and I can hear my colleagues in this department, this engineering department, tell me things like this insecurity situation is the reason why we need more drilling. We need more oil and gas exploration. We need to get more resources here in the States. We need energy independence. The more we can get, we already know how to use it. We can drive the prices of energy down by extracting more from the ground and burning it like we've always done, how we fueled the Industrial Revolution that way. We need more of that, not less. All of you environmental people out there who want to do things differently, you're forgetting about the cost that people are bearing each and every day. And if you would just let us drill offshore, private lands, indigenous areas, we can push those prices down and make the economy work for everybody. What is your response to that line of thinking and argument for a different way of producing energy?
I mean, definitely there's a supply and demand dynamic. And, we know that when energy is kind of ample in its supply, like it does impact costs. But I want to actually anchor this, my response, at least my portion of the response, in a story. So one of the reasons why I chose Texas, Karnes County, Texas, in particular, as a site for the book, is that in the mid 2010s, this was a place that was like just was like, oh, they were doing all the fracking there, right? The hydraulic
Mm-hmm.
fracturing, like, they were drilling and extracting and pipelines and all this stuff. But I interviewed a woman who basically sold the rights. So she was a homeowner. She sold the rights for them to like create the pipelines or whatever underneath her home.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, like when that money ran out, she was basically living without gas for over a year. And in that time, she was like warming up hot water on a hot plate. She was, I mean, and there was a time actually she didn't even have running water, so she had like water to like bathe and wash the dishes, and then a separate one to drink. And she was so worried about whether or not people had actually put covered the water sources, because she didn't want any of the mosquitoes and things to get in. A lot of labor, and yet we're talking about this abundant flow of energy that was literally going through the foundation of her property, but that she couldn't benefit from, because while you have this supply dynamic happening, without there being guarantees, right? Or thinking about energy as a basic right, for instance, you would have this kind of abuse, so that some people are using energy without concern somewhere else, but the
Mm-hmm.
people that are actually the communities and the households and the individuals that are facilitating that access actually could be without it for so long, and have to do all of these different workarounds just to get by. And to me, like, that's exactly the opposite. And it's, we oftentimes think about these issues and these tensions as a developing world issue, right? We need,
Mm-hmm.
the industrial revolution and like all of the kind of growth that comes from having energy access in certain domains, and how that is the distinguishing factor between industrialized societies and those that are not yet.
Right.
And this tension around like whether or not places in the global south should have access to energy in this way. But the truth is that even in this country, we have this dichotomy of people that are like the energy haves and the energy have nots. And a lot of times they live side by side.
Yeah. Jen, what are your thoughts about that? I mean, I could make an economic argument that all of your families that you work with, that are impoverished, who are struggling with energy assistance needs, should just let me go to the reservations, go to the federally protected lands, get that oil, let me process it, send it on down, and those families will be better off as a result. Like, what are your thoughts about that?
Well, I would say just historically, we don't see that in the data. So it's not like when energy prices drop, so does energy insecurity.
Oh, that's interesting.
And to Diana's point, it's, there are people who will, institutions, organizations, corporations, who know how to co-opt the profits and the rents and all the savings from these. So yes, the price of gas could go down, or the price of electricity could go down, but it's I'm very skeptical of the argument that those savings will be passed on to families.
Okay, I got you. And so we got to wrap this thing up a little bit, but I do want to end on some hope. We need a little hope before we go. And so in your chapter 13, you do lay out some policy, some initiatives that we could kind of engage to help things improve in the energy sector. We don't have time to go through all of them, but I do want to touch on a couple of things that really stood out to me. And one was the idea of energy as a human right. which I hadn't thought about. But now that I think about it, it's like, well, of course. But then why isn't it? And so there's a discussion about that in the book. And you have your sparked framework for advancing energy security. And so in the few minutes we have left, because we've been talking, I've been keeping you here longer than I should have. Touch on each of those things quickly for me and let us all know what it means, for instance, to have energy as a human right. What does it mean for it to be recognized that way? And then tell us about this framework that you've kind of introduced in your book and how that would help move things forward. I want to start with Dr. Hernández.
All right, so we have these kind of established ideas around human rights, health as a human right, housing as a human right, the right to not have like I guess the United Nations Article 48 has like this kind of breakdown of different human rights, and that's important. Energy is an enabler of all of those. There's no such thing as like the right to health, the right to housing, the right to many of the other kind of recognized human rights without energy as a kind of undercurrent. So there's that portion of it. And then the Sparked Action Framework is really about so Sparked is an acronym, and it stands for survey, screens, and public health surveillance. So the data side that Jen was talking about, participation in energy decision making, the idea that like people just need to be more involved, more knowledgeable about like the governing aspects of energy, affordable bills. How do you create pathways for affordability and variability in terms of like where people are? We see that in so many of the other sectors. But in energy, there is this kind of idea that equal is the right way to go, but that has like really unequal consequences. A robust social and energy safety net. So really thinking about how do we like anchor people and provide services when they need them. Knowledge and energy literacy. Electrification, energy efficiency, and the clean energy transition. I still believe that actually can provide a pathway to some of the energy philanthropy and donations and pantries that we also talk about as like interesting innovations in this work. And then fundamentally disconnection reform. Like, are we in a society that, like allows for and basically weaponizes access to energy because of affordability challenges? And that's a moral question that I think after reading this book, most readers are going to have to contend with at some point, is like, what is the moral obligation around the ethical consumption of energy, but also around the practices that jeopardize and compromise people's access to energy in a place where we don't have energy access problems, but this is really affordability at the core.
Yeah. Jen, what are your thoughts about that? What's the best way forward?
I think Diana perfectly conceptualized it, and she really did. She took the lead in writing the last part of the book, because I think she really has conceptualized a way forward, and now we just have to mobilize around it.
Okay. All right. So we got a framework in the book. And so before I let you go, I always give our guests one last opportunity to share whatever you believe you want us to walk away with once we turn off this episode. So, Dr. Laird, what's the one thing we need to walk away with after this conversation?
Energy is a human right, and we have a moral obligation to ensure that everyone has access to it.
Dr. Hernández?
Yeah, I just want to say that from an environmental justice perspective, energy is core to that reality, right? We sometimes want to be like labeling this justice and that justice and whatever, but like environmental justice is social justice, is economic justice, is energy justice. And like we definitely have to not only make connections, but also, get in where you fit in, because justice is a set of not just principles, but practices. And I think what you really see in this work is that there are definitely levers for change. And that to me is the thing that we should be going for, is like, how could we, based on your own interests and skill sets and gifts and talents do something in service of making people more energy secure.
All right, and we will leave it there. Dr. Hernández, Dr. Laird, thank you so much for being with us. They have written the book Powerless: The People's Struggle for Energy. Thank you so much for joining us on the podcast.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you, Dr. Joseph, for having us and for engaging with the work in a really meaningful way. We really
and thank you, and thank you for the book. It's a great book. I encourage all of you to go out and get it. I'm assuming wherever books are sold. Wherever books are sold, there's a picture.
Wherever books are sold.
Absolutely. Yes. So this has been an episode of the Environmental Justice Lab, where we are for the people and the planet. We will see you next time.